Hello, my color grading friends. Welcome to the next session of the Baselight learning program. And today I cover another of the main grading operators in Baselight. And let's get started. Today I talk about FilmGrade, which was my favorite grading operator until I met Baselight. FilmGrade originates from the digital intermediate, so it expects a display rendering transform downstream of the grading operations, which in the old days was a film print emulation, and nowadays these are the more modern DRTs. And it also expects a log-based scene-referred working color space. In my case here I'm using T-log eGamut again. Vanilla FilmGrade consists of two pages. The first one is labeled exposure, contrast, saturation, and the second one shadows, midtones, highlights. And on the bottom here we have various other parameters that are automatically mapped to the encoders on our grading panels. All of these controls here can be rearranged and reordered, and which will instantly be reflected on the grading panels. One suggestion from my side is to put the exposure here on the middle trackball to match closer to Baselight. But I'm now setting it back to the default layout. One thing I want to mention is that FilmGrade is not color space aware. So it gives different results based on different working color spaces. So currently we are applying it in T-log. If I switch that over to ACCCT or ARRI-log-C, you can see that the resulting image changes based on the working color space of the shot. Let's have a look at the individual parameters of FilmGrade, and we start with exposure, which is the most important one. Exposure is just an offset of the signal. We can see that here in the visualization curve represented. If I raise exposure, that curve is just offset to the top, and if I lower it, it's offset to the bottom. And same things happen here with the trackball. Now we're offsetting the three RGB channels of the working color space against each other. This is also one of the main differences to Baselight. FilmGrade is an RGB based operator, which brings certain characteristics with it. For example, hue shifts towards the primaries of the working color spaces under certain conditions. If you're a fan of classic printer point grading, then exposure is your friend. And you could then even set up, for example, a third page. Let's label it printer points, where you then put the RGB and the CMY exposure bumps directly onto your grading panel. And here we could also switch over to the three sliders. And so now we can here modify each RGB channel individually. And there's also a printer point mapping to the numpad. If we set the numeric keypad mode here to grading, now I can do printer point based grading here on my numpad. And about printer points, one more thing to mention is you can configure a lot of things here in the customize menu, and what I usually like to do is changing the bump behavior to don't maintain density. So that means if I'm now changing printer points, it will now change also the overall density of the image, but this is just the way that I prefer. Okay, I move back to the first page and try a simple grade on that shot. I see a yellow contamination, so I take out one or two yellow printer points. Maybe two was a little bit too much, so by holding down Command, I can move back half a point in the other direction. And I think I'm already happy with that, and I move over to the next shot. This scene here has quite a high dynamic range. So here we have the background, which is hit by direct sunlight. If I lower the exposure, we can see we can get a nice exposure back here. And if I raise the exposure parameter, we can see then we get a nice exposure for the foreground. And what I want to illustrate here is one of the differences between FilmGrade and Baselight, because FilmGrade is typically applied in a log-based working color space, and these log working color spaces typically have a toe in the shadows, which makes sense. But this brings then some overcompensation in the shadows with it. So let me show you that here. So when I lower the exposure a lot, we can see that we're really losing here some of the values in the shadows, in the blacks. So they're really going below the 0 line. And if I raise it a lot, the image gets very, very milky. I show you the similar operation here in Baselight. So now if I'm stopping it down heavily, you can see that instead of really losing the details here, they are just compressed very heavily in the blacks. So that's a subtle difference. And when I'm raising the exposure a lot, we can see that the contrast here of the foreground stays more normal for a longer range. So it's not looking as milky yet as in FilmGrade. And so generally I prefer the way Baselight behaves, but there are some circumstances where the FilmGrade behavior is giving nicer results. On the next shot we have a similar case, but with color. We have a really strong green color cast here, coming from a green light in the scene, and we want to balance that out. So I will use the exposure parameter for that, but instead of trying it manually, I will show you the balance exposure tool in FilmGrade. Balance exposure drives the RGB exposure based on a pick in the image, and you need to pick something that should be neutral. So I will use that white piece of the costume here. And we can see that exposure is a really nice tool to work on global color casts. But in direct comparison to Baselight balance, for example, you will notice that the shadows can be overcorrected with heavy corrections like this one here. So here we see a magenta contamination in the darker areas of the images. So when doing heavy lifting work with exposure, doesn't matter if it's color-based or brightness-based, you should expect to do some minor tweaks of the shadows afterwards. Moving on to the next shot. So here we have a really low contrast scene, probably caused by some stray light hitting the lens. And so we have a good opportunity to examine the other main parameters, contrast and saturation. Contrast adjusts the slope of our curve. If I increase the contrast, that means values brighter than a certain point get even brighter, and values darker than a certain value get darker. And that middle point is the contrast pivot, which I can also shift around. And this is then the pivot point for that slope rotation. With contrast, the curve always stays a straight line. So it's not an S-curve based contrast. You might wonder why, and the reason is, as I mentioned before, FilmGrade expects a DRT or a print film emulation downstream, and that DRT applies the S-curve to the image. So using an S-curve here does not make sense. Okay, for this shot here, now I will increase the contrast. So let's do a little bit too much to show you some other technique. So when we apply a lot of contrast, we can then decide with the contrast pivot where we want to push most of the added contrast. So let's say now we might lose too much details here in the shadows, and we want to push the added contrast more into the highlights. And to do that, I just need to slowly lower the contrast pivot. And by lowering the contrast pivot, it is now pushing more of the added contrast to the highlights. Or I can do the opposite. When I raise the contrast pivot, we push it more into the shadows. Let's look at the extremes for the contrast pivot. If we bring it all the way down to 0, then contrast behaves exactly like gain in FilmGrade, also color-wise. And if we move it all the way up to 1023, so it's based on 10-bit code values, these pivot points, then it behaves exactly like lift in FilmGrade. But with the contrast pivot, we have also all the shades in between lift and gain, one could argue. I always imagine it in a way that with lift and gain, we are holding both ends of that line and we're moving the endpoints. And with contrast, we're holding the line somewhere in the middle at the contrast pivot point, and we're then rotating around that pivot point. So the point to take away is we can do similar operations to lift and gain with contrast and contrast pivot, but with different handles on the curve. Okay, now let's work on that image. What I would do is raise the contrast a lot, probably. Yeah, maybe something like this. Then we can also have a quick look at the saturation tool here. With saturation, as the name suggests, we can change the saturation of the image. And the algorithm underneath is the same one as in FilmGrade. So there is no difference between FilmGrade and FilmGrade saturation. But what I really like about the FilmGrade saturation is that it's mapped to one of the large rings. And I really like working on contrast and saturation on the large rings on the panel. But that's just my personal preference. Now let's have a look at the color parameters of contrast and saturation. And for that, I move into a second layer. So this is also my recommendation. When you work with the trackballs in contrast and saturation, do that in an isolated layer, because with these parameters, you should be more cautious. The contrast trackball offsets the contrast of each of the RGB channels against each other. I move the trackball into the warm direction, and that means the contrast of the red curve is now stronger than the one of the green curve, and that one is stronger than the one of the blue curve. And we see as a net effect on the image that the highlights are tinted warmer, because here red and green are higher than blue, and the shadows are tinted in the complementary cold color. So they are getting colder because here blue is higher than green and red. So what we see is what I usually call a cross-toning effect on the image. So the highlights are getting warmer, the shadows colder. And with the contrast pivot, I can decide which areas in the image should be tinted warm and which areas should be tinted cold. So this is like the cutoff between cold and warm area here. So I will quickly store that into a scratchpad slot so that I can show you some more examples. So what you should remember is always the direction where you move the trackball is the color for the highlights. So we could also do, for example, here magenta highlights, green shadows, or we do blue highlights, warm shadows, and maybe this one here, green highlights, magenta shadows, and here we have one more. Now I will quickly flip through the different looks, and you can see it has a very strong effect on the global look of the image. My advice is don't use that for shot-by-shot grading. So personally, I never do that in my first layers where I do the shot-by-shot adjustments, but I often use that tool here more at the bottom of the stack to build certain looks. Maybe after balancing all the shots, then to try out different looks to see where it resonates well with the image. For example, this one here, and then we could go in and maybe fade it a little bit back to make the overall effect a little bit more subtle. Okay, but let's reset that and have a look at the saturation trackball. The saturation trackball is not the same as the exposure trackball. It's more focused towards the highlights. So it behaves similar to the gain trackball in FilmGrade, but not exactly the same. But you can imagine it as a color balance that is focused more towards the highlights. In this example here, I could maybe try a very slight tint towards the warm colors. Yeah, and we could try again a little bit of our cross-toning effect here to then get a nice tweak on the look of the image. And if I bypass both of our FilmGrade operations now, we can see that we get a really nice effect on that shot. Okay, moving on. This shot here has a really strong contrast in the scene. So we can see here that strong light hitting the hand. So here we want to lower the contrast. And my advice is do that contrast lowering really heavily. So here now we have really milky blacks. The image does not look realistic anymore. And then in a second step, we move to the second page and then lower just the shadows parameter. Here I realize the range that I have going down to -0.5 is not sufficient, but instead of turning on extended ranges, I just raise the shadows pivot so that more parts of the image are pulled down. And so now you can see we have a really strong contrast lowering effect, but still maintain a good black level in the image. So this is one of the techniques I wanted to share with you. Okay, next shot. FilmGrade is not a physically based grading tool in comparison to Baselight. So I show you quickly here in Baselight, when I tint the shadows, for example, cold, there's a natural relationship between the color and the brightness. Something that is completely black means there is no light, and if there is no light, there can also be no color. So there's that natural behavior and roll-off of colorfulness and brightness in the shadows. And when we have a look at FilmGrade, we can see that here with the shadows tool, we can do more artificial tinting of the shadows with that parameter. So here, if we want to have that really, I often call it like a print paper look with one of the color channels really offset against the other ones, this is something that you can't do in Baselight. So Baselight will always look a little bit more plausible and realistic, but with FilmGrade shadows we can do these more abstract effects. So what does the shadows, midtones, highlights tool do? Let's examine that curve here again. Shadows just works the curve in the lower region up until the shadows pivot point. So if I move that, we can see that the curve always stays smooth under all conditions, and with the shadows pivot we control that point where the tool kicks in. Midtones is a tool that I rarely use, and you can see it bends the curve here in the middle, which then corresponds more to the midtones. Midtones does not have a pivot, but it is influenced by the shadows and the highlights pivot. Okay, I reset all of that. The highlights tool is the opposite of the shadows tool, so it works on the curve here down to a certain point, which is the highlights pivot point. Okay, let's reset and move on to the next shot. So on this shot here, maybe we start with a global grade. So I would lower the exposure first a little bit, and probably we can then raise also the contrast to some extent. And what we then realize in a shot like this that does not contain a lot of specular highlights is we don't use the brightest values in our display color space because the roll-off in the DRT is active. And we can imagine the DRT in a very simplified way as an S-curve. Sometimes we want to push against that S of that DRT S-curve. I create a new layer for that here and switch to FilmGrade again. And this is what these shadows, midtones, highlights tools are actually made for. First, let's do the opposite and lower highlights and raise shadows. And what we end up with is basically an S. And so if we want to push against the S-curve of the DRT, so the only thing we need to do is then here raise the highlights value. We can see it does not have a strong effect. And again, don't push it further than the normal range. Instead, now take the highlights pivot and lower it slowly. And so now we can see we can get a really strong boost here into the highlights. And my typical technique is first move it all the way up to 0.5 and then lower it to a more gentle value. Something between 0.3 and 0.4 I usually settle with then in the end. And so now we can see we get that nice boost here into the highlights without sacrificing the overall contrast. Because in comparison, if I bypass that one more time, if we would try to use the higher range just with exposure, we can see now we're just moving the overall image harder into the soft clip, so into the soft roll off. So we're losing the contrast here. And if we would have raised the contrast here more and more, then the overall image would have gotten more contrasty. Also the shadows, and this is also something that we don't always want to do. So for these instances, highlights in FilmGrade is a nice tool to work with. So let's see it here at the end of the shot as well, before, after highlights. This shot here is a similar example. I want to show the same principle. With the overall grade, I'm already happy here. So I think we don't need to do anything here. It's really nicely shot. And I go to the second layer, go to FilmGrade. Then here to leverage more that top range in our display color space, I boost up the highlights curve all the way up to 0.5. Then slowly lower the highlights pivot until I see a nice effect, maybe somewhere here. And then relax that one here back a bit, maybe to 0.4 or to 0.3. And let's see the before and after. This is before, this is after. I think again a nice example of how we can use the highlights tool. So this is what I sometimes refer to as energizing the highlights. And because we are doing this in RGB, this boosts up not only the luminance and the contrast in the highlights, but also the saturation. Because the saturation is the difference between the color channels, and with a higher contrast we also see higher differences between the RGB channels and therefore higher saturation. This is also one of the major differences between FilmGrade contrast and the Baselight contrast tool. FilmGrade contrast works in RGB and therefore affects the saturation. In Baselight, the contrast only works on the achromatic signal. And which one is the right way to do contrast? I would say it depends. Sometimes one works better, sometimes the other. As with many things in color grading, there is no clear right and wrong here. Okay, I move on to the next shot. And here I do the opposite of energizing the highlights, because here we have some really intense and also disturbing highlights. This is something that I call de-energizing the highlights. And in this case, again, I use the FilmGrade highlights tool. I pull it all the way down to 0.5. I'm still not 100% happy with that result. So then I'm even lowering the highlights pivot to increase the effect of the highlights, maybe up until this point here. So now we have a really strong effect. And I can show you the before and after. This is before, this is after, and you can see the image now looks much less disturbing in the highlights. And as mentioned before, lowering the highlights does not only lower the luminance, but also the saturation and the contrast all at once. In the last shot here, I want to first show a similar example. Let's first do a grade on the shot, so I might raise the exposure globally a little bit. Let's find a nicer frame for our grade. And here again we have a little bit, so that chandelier is blowing out in the highlights. So I would add a new layer, go to FilmGrade, highlights, and now we can lower again the highlights all the way down to -0.5. If we're not happy yet, I take the highlights pivot, pull it down a little bit further. So this should already give us a little bit softer, more relaxed look here on the chandelier, but it's now also losing the color. And when the highlights are all the way pulled down to the extreme, we can't move the color here anymore. So for that, we need to activate the extended ranges. And with the extended ranges active, I can now dial in even a little bit of the warm color back here into the highlights. Maybe like that. Now I want to show you the before and after. So this is before, this is after. Let's zoom out and do it one more time here. Before, after. Having touched the extended ranges, I want to show you another example in that area. I create a new layer for it, switch to FilmGrade, activate extended ranges. Once again, I want to mention, be very careful when you activate extended ranges and you work with shadows, midtones, highlights. In this case, I move the shadows all the way up to 1.0, and this performs a hard clip in the shadows, then on the level of the shadows pivot. So if we want to have a more abstract clipped look with lifted clipped blacks in the shadows, then we could do it like that. So this is now a very extreme example. We would probably relax that one a little bit. I show you how. We would lower the shadows here, maybe tint it also with a specific color. In that case, let's go into a more deepish blue. And then we could also fade back the effect of the whole layer a little bit with the result blending. And we would go to that result. And the very last thing I want to show you about FilmGrade is how to use it as a technical hard clipper. So let's convert here, for example, into the display color space in the stack. So now below the color space strip, the image is now in Rec 1886, 2.4 gamma, Rec 709, the display referred color space. Now I go into FilmGrade, extended ranges again. And this time, let's use the highlights for hard clipping. I pull them all the way down to -1. And then I can just dial in the code value where I want to perform the hard clip. So now we are hard clipping everything at 10-bit code value 600. When I pick the image, you can see all the values stay below 600. Okay. So that's a technique of how to perform a hard clip in a display color space. And this was all I wanted to show today. And I move on to the questions. Okay, so here's one question about the tonal ranges and the differences between exposure in FilmGrade and balance in Baselight, if one of them is maybe focused more on a specific tonal range, like the midtones. And the answer is that both do not favor a certain tonal range, so both work globally on the whole tonal range of the images. They are very comparable to a white balance in the camera or in a RAW decoder. And the difference that I pointed out also in the presentation is that exposure can overcompensate the shadows. And that's because of the toe in the log working color spaces. And that toe is nice to have, but that's then one of the side effects. So when you do heavy lifting with exposure, you should expect to do maybe shadow tweaks afterwards. And the other question is about the shadows tool in FilmGrade and how it compares to the flare operator in Baselight. Yeah, both do similar operations, and there are two differences I want to point out. One is that shadows can also work on the color, so you can do these color offsets that I just showed, and flare can't do that. And shadows has a pivot point, so there you can decide how smooth it kicks in the shadows, if it should be a really harsh transition or a really smooth transition, and how much range of the image is really affected. So this you can do with the pivot. And flare doesn't have a pivot because there's only one physically plausible way to add or redo or remove flare from an image. So flare is physically accurate, so that's why it doesn't need a pivot, and shadows can therefore do also more artificial effects. Okay, that's it for today. I say thank you for watching and see you next time in the Baselight learning program.